All right, hello. Welcome to another episode of Automation Ladies. Today's guest is somebody that I've been waiting to get on the show for, I don't know, 2, 3 years or since around the time we started. Kerry Pierce, welcome to Automation Ladies. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me. It's a real honor.
Well, we met in person. I don't know, was it the first time this Automate this time around, or had we met briefly before that?
That was the very first time, actually.
Okay, I'm glad I got that
Yeah.
right. Sometimes I meet people briefly, but if I don't get to know them, like I kind of forget. And then with the mixture of seeing people on LinkedIn a lot, if I haven't like had a more personal interaction with you at a show, sometimes I do meet people and I forget that I've met them in person, or vice versa. I feel like I know you so well from LinkedIn that I'm like, we must have met before, right? My timeline gets a little skewed with that. So yeah, I guess I'll just start with those of you in our network, Automation Ladies. If you don't know Kerry Pierce, I will let Kerry introduce herself. But I feel like I've been sharing like your comic strip and your posts for a while, so I think a lot of our listeners may already know who you are. But if they don't, can you answer our only sort of standard question here on Automation Ladies, which is tell us the story of how you got into being in machine vision integration, or what it is that you do now.
Sure. So I kind of like to say that I fell into automation because I went to school for engineering. I got a degree in computer engineering, and when I went into it, I didn't really have solid expectations of what I was going to do after university. Um, they taught us how to do stuff on like robots, and I took a machine vision class, and my senior project was a machine vision application, but we really didn't honestly know much of what we were doing at the time. In hindsight, there's so much about that project that I would have changed, knowing now what I do. But so I had some exposure to industrial automation equipment, but I never really put two and two together of, you can actually do really cool things with this technology, and there's a whole sector of engineering that is centered around making things that make things. Um, you
Yeah.
know, I I had watched like the show How It's Made as a kid, but I never really like thought about, oh yeah, that's a whole career path behind all those machines that make the stuff. And so it didn't really like click with me until I graduated and I went to the university job fair. And this one little small startup company, they were a machine vision company, and they made their own proprietary robot guidance software. And they were pretty much the only offer that I got straight out of college. And I know they typically say don't take the first offer that you're given. It's I know it's generally what's not advised when you're getting your first job out of
Yeah.
college, but that's what I did.
So did I.
And glad that I'm in good company there.
Yeah.
But so I honestly had no clue what integration was or how to do it, and it was a real learning experience. In fact, back when I was first interviewing a bunch of companies, a machine vision, or not necessarily machine vision specifically, but just a generalized integrator, had
Yeah.
interviewed me, and they were asking, "Do you have any questions for me?" And I was like, "Yeah. So can you tell me about how you ensure sustainability in your practices?" Because I had absolutely no clue what an integrator does.
Yeah.
I didn't realize that they don't really make things; they just make other things do things that are supposed to be making things. So it was a real eye opener when I got out into the industry and saw just how much there is to industrial automation. And it was a rough learning experience. I'm not going to lie. Being a total newbie into this field, not really knowing much of anything.
Yeah.
One of the most humbling experiences for me was the first time I ever had to train a group of engineers and technicians at a plant. And I was, standing in front of people who had been working at that facility for longer than I had been alive, and realizing like I know absolutely nothing, and I am here to teach you today.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I honestly just kind of fell into automation because I didn't really know what it was when I joined, but I really fell in love with it, and I don't think I could see myself in any other industry at this point.
What kind of engineering degree did you get, and what made you interested in engineering?
Computer engineering is my degree. So I started out as a mechanical engineering major, but after a couple of years of taking those basic classes, I realized that the material sciences and properties of materials classes just really wasn't a point of interest for me. I found it not very interesting. And my sophomore year, as part of our core curriculum for the mechanical engineering degree, we had to take a C programming class. And
Okay.
that was my first real exposure to programming, and I discovered that okay, I'm not necessarily like fantastic at this, but I think I can learn it, and it's actually really interesting. So
Yeah.
that's kind of when I decided to experiment and take that pivot into computer engineering instead of mechanical, and I'm really glad that I did. It's not super imperative out in the industry what specific engineering degree you have. I found, it seems like yeah they care for the first job that you get, and then once you have an established track record, it really doesn't matter if you're a mechanical or an electrical or a computer engineer. Just showing that you have an engineering background, you can get into just about anything.
Well, especially since
As
they don't have machine vision engineers or controls engineering as a discipline at most places anyway. It's not like you can get
right,
that.
exactly. And as for how I first got into engineering or wanted to pursue it, so when I was entering high school, okay, so let's back up a little bit. I was homeschooled up until the ninth grade, so I had very little knowledge of really what I wanted to do. I had this broad idea that I wanted to become a cartoonist, or I wanted to do like video game design. That was my more later interest. And when I was entering high school, my district offered a computer animation class, but it had a prerequisite of taking a CAD class first. Um,
Okay.
and so and so I was like, okay, I'll take this CAD. I don't know what CAD is, but I'll give it a shot. And I discovered that I actually really liked it. And by the time that I got to my sophomore year, they had actually canceled the animation program. So I don't want to say I took CAD for no reason, but it's kind of a happy accident that I did because I
Yeah.
discovered that, I really liked this whole design aspect, and it's kind of cool. So then my second year, I joined the robotics team, the competitive robotics team at my high school. And at that
Okay.
time, they were just competing in like a little local league.
Okay.
But that year, we had established with a bunch of us in that group that we were going to start an FRC team and actually join the first robotics competition. And that was kind of what sealed the deal for me that, engineering is really cool and I really like robots. And I had no concept about vision yet at that point until college. But
Yeah.
yeah,
I
that's
feel
kind of what steered me in this direction.
my high school did not have a robotics team that I know of. I was in AP physics, and I think I would have known the nerds that would have been in the robotics club if we had one. I had no idea that was even a thing until my second job where we sponsored a first team. Um,
Oh, wow.
yeah, so it's crazy. Yeah, most of the people that we interview, and the reason why we ask this question is because happy accident or by some random, coincidence or, something like that is typically kind of the answer because most people don't know that these careers exist. Um, and sometimes it's like a role model that leads somebody into engineering and then a happy accident that you learn that this isn't even a discipline of engineering. Yeah, so add one check mark to the happy accident box of how us, how we got to be in this field. Which I think
Absolutely.
now with robotics and automation becoming a little bit more mainstream and the humanoids, all that buzzy news, like may inspire more kids now to get involved with robots because they seem closer to reality. Plus, growing up, I don't know, my kids, they've seen a lot of like animated movies with robots, and then I have to be the one to tell them like that robots that are that smart don't exist yet, or they can't really do that kind of stuff. But they have this whole, imaginative world about robots that I didn't have growing up. But then the reality of like the machinery, like OEM machinery that makes things, I still don't know where people are supposed to find out about that kind of stuff because like you, I love how it's made, but a lot of those factories are very old school and like they're
Mhm.
proud to show off their generations or 100 years of like making the same thing a certain way, which is really cool. And it goes to show that like this machinery sticks around making a product as long as there's demand for that product. That machine can churn those products out for decades, if not longer. but they're definitely not showing like the state of the art stuff in a lot of ways. And I think that's maybe because of, you know, the whole secrecy and NDAs of our industry. People want to keep their competitive advantage about how they make things.
Right,
Which is
absolutely.
important for us as we're trying to attract more talent, right? We're like, ooh, we do some really cool stuff you don't get to know about, but you should be interested. Like, how exactly?
Absolutely.
Cool. Yeah. So you got into machine vision kind of right off the bat. So did I, not having any
Mhm.
idea what it was. My path was a little bit different. I went to work for Keyence, which is primarily a sensor manufacturer, but they have a very strong machine vision division. And machine vision was kind of newer there at the time. And it took a little bit of like internal process to get selected for that department and then to find a job opening that supported that. But I fully credit them with my interest in all of this. I think having a hands-on demo of one of their products during the first in-person interview definitely also showed me like, hey, I'm gonna get to like learn from day one, which is very cool. Because I, like you, kind of, or I don't know why I said like you, but certain things bore me. Like reading too much about stuff that doesn't have like a practical hands-on application doesn't typically hold my attention for too long. And
Yeah, I agree with
yeah,
that wholeheartedly. So indeed, like me.
I wish that more people like, I don't know, there's a whole bunch of STEM kits and stuff for kids now. So, and I can't say that I know what all of them are. But now I'm envisioning it would be really cool. Like even just the way that we demoed vision systems back in the day, and I'm not sure if it's still done or not, but we had these little cards with different types of like
Yep.
printed things on them to show the different algorithms and how it can catch this and catch that. Like just playing with those demos was
Yeah.
so much fun as you're learning.
Oh
Yeah.
yeah,
And
we still see a bunch of those kinds of demos whenever a vendor comes in showing off the newest technology. They have a whole little briefcase full of the sensor and the power supply and the demo
yeah.
parts, and they set it up in like 5 minutes, and it's absolute magic that it works so well for 5 minute setup.
Yeah, because you get so good at it because you do it repeatedly, right? And then
Right.
ours was programmed with a little handheld like joystick thing, and it just takes a little bit of practice, and then you get good at it. Like gamers will tell you, it's like if you don't play video games, it's not very intuitive, like where you press the buttons on the controller and stuff. But like pro gamers, like they could do it with their eyes closed. Same thing with the little handheld thing. It's like you get really good at it, and then people be like, "Wow, that looks, I would never be able to do it that fast." And I'm like, well, run through this 10 times and it gets pretty intuitive. But for me,
Right.
I never got into computer programming. Actually have a business degree, but I tend to think a little bit like systems. And so for me, like the drag and drop type programming of vision systems, which most systems nowadays I would think like they have a GUI option, they have a scripting option, right? It's pretty different ways of doing it. But I also realized like you don't have to be an engineer by education to be able to learn how to use these systems and put applications together. And now I do a lot of other types of programming, quote unquote, today that are, drag and drop, do this, then do that, and if this, then do that. Like it applies to so many things, right? And if you can start thinking
Absolutely.
about things in that manner, right? And that's really how you think of a production line too, and all the inputs and outputs and stuff like that. Yeah, it's very fun.
Yeah. It's always fun whenever I meet another vision engineer, kind of getting a feel for what style of vision programming they prefer, because it can tell you a lot about their kind of experience with programming in general. If they say, oh yeah, I'm purely a GUI programmer, then it's like, okay, you probably haven't gotten too deep into the nitty gritty of the coding side of things, and that's okay, because a lot of these systems are perfectly capable of working that way. But then you have the opposite side of the spectrum where there are people who are like, oh, I only do Halcon scripting, which I haven't touched that. That's even beyond what I've done so far. But yeah, it's pretty cool to see the spectrum of preference for who likes what and what you can do with these different platforms. Because a lot of them, even though they do ultimately the same thing,
hmm
their algorithms work different enough that there's a noticeable difference, and you can make very educated decisions about which software you feel best suits that particular application based on how you think you're going to solve the problem with those algorithms.
Yeah, we have very wide-ranging tool belts in a lot of areas of industrial automation, like many different ways of accomplishing the same thing, right?
Hmm.
And oftentimes, I guess it kind of, the success can be based on like your technical requirements or the skill set of the people involved, right? Some tools are going to be better for certain types of people. Like for me, yeah, you wouldn't give. I could solve a problem with the GUI based system. I can program an HMI when it's a GUI based programming environment. Um, I'm not going to go program a PLC. Like it's just that's not
Right.
within the skill set, right? Um, but there's really like a role for every type of learner and every type of programmer in our space, whether you even have an engineering degree or not. So tell me about your comic strip. What made you start that? And do you still do it? I haven't seen it in my feed for a while, but I'm not going to assume that that means you're not doing them anymore because I think the feed changed quite a bit recently and I don't see a lot of the stuff that I wish I saw.
It did change recently, and I've been getting a little annoyed with the algorithm. But I haven't been posting the comic strip for a while yet. I've been on kind of a long-term hiatus. I was dealing with, well, first it was my wedding that was coming up last summer, so that was taking up a lot of my
That's a
time
big
and
project.
mental energy.
Yeah.
And then I just kind of had a little bit of burnout, so I was taking a brief break after that. And then some stuff came up in my family. And so it's just been like one thing after the next. It's been kind of extending that hiatus, but I'm not finished with it, that's for sure. I intend to get back into it. But for those of you who don't really know what we're talking about here, last year I had started this comic strip called The Ingenoob, and it's kind of a fictional account of what my experience was like entering industrial automation as someone who knew absolutely nothing about it to begin with. So it kind of follows the comedy of errors and all the fun little quirky situations that systems integrators encounter out in the field. Specifically from that perspective of someone who didn't know what they were getting into ahead of time. And it's meant to kind of chronicle her growth as an engineer and as a systems integrator. Realistically, as I've grown as an engineer and a systems integrator. And I created it with the intent of making our industry more appealing and more approachable to those who might not know much about it.
Yeah.
Because like we said, there's really not much way to promote industrial automation, especially with all the the secrecy and everything. And it's hard to embody something that's so non-physical as PLC programming or vision programming. Um, but so I wanted to create something that's accessible and something that people can relate to, because even if you're not involved in industrial automation, you can kind of see these humorous situations and you can kind of relate on a personal level of, oh yeah, I've been through something similar in my own field. So I wanted to just kind of get a broader audience, get their attention onto our industry with this.
Yeah, that's really cool and I commend you honestly, like doing a side thing like that in your spare time in a profession like this that typically doesn't give a lot of spare time. I'd say it's a credit to anyone trying to bring more eyeballs to this industry. But I think also the message, yeah, absolutely, like you said, it transcends the industrial automation industry specifically. I hear this a lot, but engineers coming out of college, you learn a lot of things, right? Knowledge and foundational things. But then what you are actually expected to know and do in your job when you graduate and go out into industry, and this is probably common for all different types of degrees. I feel like my business degree did not teach me most of the stuff that I actually do in my job or have ever done in my job. They laid some foundation, taught me how to learn and things like that. But then, the actual specific things I learned, did I take those and immediately apply them in my job? No, not really. And the feeling of not being prepared for your first job, I think is kind of universal in a lot of ways. And especially as an engineer, I've heard this a bit, but the newer engineers' reluctance to admit that they don't know things, right? Because they feel like they should know them. And there's some, I don't know what it is, ego or just like this, they've built up an expectation that they should know things. And so they feel bad admitting when they don't know something, right? And so to me, one of the things that really drew me in about the comic strip was your kind of ability to talk about yourself and laugh about the things you didn't know or that you learned the hard way And then, yeah, so many of us have had those experiences, and you don't necessarily always share them, especially right away. Like, they're harder to share than later on. You can laugh at them when it's like a few weeks or maybe a few years later, and it doesn't sting so much to think about them. But I always really enjoy when I see the strip, because oftentimes, like, I connect to it very directly, right? Also, us having the fact that having done machine vision in common, and machine vision is one of those things where, like, it doesn't really solve anything out of the box. Like, you have to make it work for every single application, and every single application is different, and there's so much that can go wrong.
Absolutely.
I'm remembering one where you mentioned you, like, backed up into something, like a switch, or, like, I totally backed up into a button in the elevator at Automate and, like, pushed it. I pushed the alarm with my butt, and it totally made me think of one of your comic strips. Like,
Yeah, so that was a post that I did, kind of explaining one of the situations that I got into, around my second or so year in automation. We were doing a vision system for a tier one automotive supplier, and it was on a wheel and tire system. And basically, you know how scarce seating is along an industrial line. Like, there's no chairs anywhere, so you are lucky to pop a squat wherever you can.
yeah, or
And
bring it in or something.
yeah, and so my uneducated self decided to pop a squat on the side of the guardrail of the manufacturing line, and I didn't think anything of it. I wasn't really touching anything, so it should be fine. So my colleague and I were working on the vision system, and we had a tire come into the station, and it did its inspection, and it gave a pass result, so it should have released the tire, and then it goes on and does its next thing. But the tire didn't leave, so we hit the retry button to see if we could get it to leave this time, and no, it didn't. It still stayed there. So at this point, the technician from the plant comes over and is kind of like, "Hey, what's going on? Like, why are you holding up the line?" And we tried to tell him, like, "Hey, it's not our system. We think it's the PLC that's holding everything up, because it's just sitting there and we're giving you a pass result. We can't control anything at this point." Yeah. So he goes off grumbling to go check out and see what's going on his side of the thing. And meanwhile, all these tires beyond it are building up on the line, one every few seconds or so. So yeah. the line is getting like miles long, and he can't figure out what's wrong on his end, and alarms start going off, and suddenly we have like 5 people from the plant surrounding us, and then it's like 10 people from the plant surrounding us. Everyone's like combing every inch of the manufacturing line, and meanwhile we've been down for like 20 plus minutes at this point. The line is starved. All the operators are standing around looking like, "Can we go home early? Like, is that what's going on here?" And a whole bunch of important managers come down, all huffing and puffing, what's going on. And this one other technician comes running up, and he walks with purpose to the part of the line where I'd been sitting earlier, and he twists on this little sensor on the side of it, and suddenly the line roars back to life, and the tire leaves, and everything's fine. And as the whole crowd was kind of dispersing, we pulled him aside and asked him, like, "Hey, how'd you know what was wrong?" And he tells me very discreetly that, "Well, I saw you sitting there earlier, and your butt kind of knocked the proximity sensor out of alignment, so I knew to check that." I was so humiliated. So my bodacious booty brought production to a standstill for over 30 minutes, and that's one of my crowning achievements.
I think, yeah, you end up collecting these stories. Like, if you haven't really done something like that, like, I don't think you've been around enough to have, you end up with some of this, like, tribal knowledge or whatever. And he obviously saw you there, but also knew enough and had enough history to know that is what might have happened. Right. Where, like, just objectively, like, a brand new person just looking at, oh, this was done, like, would not have caught that whatsoever. Which I think a lot of what we end up doing on this job is kind of like a combination of built up experience and then some intuition that you gain by these different experiences, good and bad, right? Like, you kind of have to have had some things go wrong to then start to have an intuition of how to troubleshoot or what to look for, even the non-intuitive things.
Absolutely. I feel like it's almost a unicorn situation to have a project where nothing goes wrong in automation. You go in with the expectation that there's always going to be something wrong.
Yeah.
And I can only think of one example of a system that I worked on that was like my miracle unicorn, where everything just kind of went right from the start. And that was one of my favorite systems for that reason. But I also have favorite systems that were, favorites because they were such spectacular garbage heaps that everything just went wrong, one thing after the next. I have a bit of a track record of having a bunch of what I call chronic projects. Those
Yeah,
are
talk to
typically,
me about a chronic project. What is that, and how?
yeah.
Yeah, let's
So
talk.
yeah, so the way that I define that is kind of like one of those projects that, usually for reasons outside of the engineering itself, were, not well defined enough to really be, resolved quickly.
Yeah.
It's usually a situation where you, especially with machine vision, where you go in not really knowing right from the get-go if the project is even possible or not.
Hmm.
And it's tricky because you you make a certain agreement with the customer that you're going to get a vision system out of this, but it's also very difficult to get them on the same level of understanding as you, that this is a R&D project and we're not guaranteeing that you're going to have a fully functional system at the end of this.
Yeah.
It's possible that we might put all this work in, all this expense, all these hours, and you might realistically not actually have a solution in the end because we find that it's just not possible. But so I consider those to be chronic projects or science projects, whatever you want to call them, the things that you go in with the expectation that it may or may not work. And I've been on a bunch of those projects before. I don't know if I'm like a magnet for them or what, but
It also takes a certain type of person to be willing to take them on because they aren't quick wins. They're not guaranteed. And though there are people that will shy away from the complicated projects or the ones that aren't a slam dunk, like ones that don't look like the thing that's in the catalog, right? Because it is a challenge and it can be mentally draining. It can be hard. It can, you almost feel like it can affect your reputation. Like I almost think of like doctors that don't want to take complicated surgeries because they don't want their like success rate to go down.
right,
There's some that will take it because they will take the risk, and then others will be like, nope, I don't do that, right? And I'm the person that says yes to things that other people say no to. So I have also ended up with a bunch of stuff that not necessarily a chronic project, but like I will take the time to test a bunch of stuff that a bunch of other people have been like, nope, doesn't work, can't do it. And
right.
sometimes I do get it to work, and then other times I have to be like, yep, I also couldn't get it to work, right? But it's not the most comfortable position to be in for sure to work on those sorts
No,
of things.
especially because I was on a particular project for one of the big three automakers, and it was a very high profile project, so there were a lot of eyeballs on this development. And I spent well over 2 years in development on that project. Not always continuous work, but it was pretty steady work for 2 full years. I clocked thousands of hours on that, and just because of the complexity of the project and because of what they were trying to accomplish with the hardware that they had specified, it just ended up not panning out to be a success in the end, which was a big disappointment. That's definitely not something that a young engineer really wants on their reputation of, oh yeah, you were the one who had the really, really important project that didn't succeed.
Yeah.
But I think it's a valuable learning experience, not only for me, but also for the customer as to, what went wrong and how you can establish a better practice moving forward and what is or isn't possible.
Yeah.
But also just kind of trying to learn how to cope with that, that disappointment of I put all this time and energy into it. I was on site for 6 months straight and it still didn't work. It's heavy and it's
Yeah.
not for everybody. Like I recognize that automation really isn't for everyone necessarily because it can be very high stress, especially on site. Um,
Hmm.
Especially when you're inheriting projects that maybe you didn't touch from the start, and you're kind of getting up to speed. There was one where I was brought in after it had been running for, again, about 2 years or so. And this project had a lot of baggage to it. So there were a lot of complications throughout the life cycle, and there was a lot of disappointment on both sides from both the customer and from us. And basically, like the customer was at their wits' end by the time that I inherited the project, and I was very young and inexperienced, and I was on site, and they just ripped into me with frustration. It hurt because it felt personal to me at that time, but
Yeah.
it really wasn't about me. It was about me as a representative of my team that had been dealing with this for years. And I had a really good talk with my manager that night because I was kind of crying on the phone on the drive home, and I was just torn up and I was shaken. And he was telling me, like, it's just a bunch of car parts. Like, don't let that destroy you. Like, it's just a bunch of car parts. They'll survive. We'll get through this. And that kind of really put things into perspective for me that, it's just because they're frustrated with the project doesn't mean that they're frustrated with me. But I realized that that's something that not necessarily every new engineer is going to understand right from the get-go.
Yeah, for sure. No, I think even if you're not young, just the emotions involved, people's, not maybe careers are on the line, but like, people get personal with this kind of stuff, even though it's not supposed to, because it just feels like, I've had engineers tell me, or Allie in some situations, like, oh, it's engineering. It's not about feelings. Like, feelings have no place here. And I'm like, we are human beings doing engineering, and human beings have feelings regardless of whether or not we want to. And so, yeah, there will be feelings. And even the person saying this was using it in a context where I'm like, dude, you're all about your feelings right now, which is why you're saying that it's not about feelings. Like, you wouldn't be having this outburst about it's not about feelings if you weren't having some really big feelings, man. It's okay. Like,
right.
I also got yelled at by a customer. Maybe, I don't know. I think I can only think of one time, like, specifically where somebody like really raised their voice at me and like straight up yelled at me in my face. And it also made me cry a lot. And it had nothing to do with me. I stepped into a territory that hadn't had a sales manager for a few months, and the person before me got fired because there were delivery issues, supply chain problems, and that person wasn't staying on top of it and wasn't giving their customer, the customers updates. And so I kind of stepped into a shit show that, nobody is really going to be able to make everybody happy in that situation, at least not right off the bat, right? You have to come in and like assess things and, like slowly try to make things better. And it wasn't about me at all. It was about that prior, experience that this customer was feeling. But I took it really personally. Like, it's really hard because I like to help people. I like to please people. I like to make things work. I like to, I wouldn't have been golfing when my customer wasn't getting their product sent to them. But here I am following in that person's footsteps and feeling like the residual anger that was directed at my company, right? Not at me personally, but it can be a tough situation to be in. And to learn to kind of detach yourself from that, or let yourself feel those feelings, but at the end of the day, rationalize, it isn't about me. Like, this is okay. I can go home. But I will say, like, I also had an integration project at the end of, so that was at the beginning of stepping into that job. At the very end of, right around the time I left that job, because there were just so many things out of my control that I felt like as a salesperson, I had no control over it, so it was hard for me to represent the results. Even though I had really great products, really great people that I worked with, good teams, like sometimes there's things you can't control. Like supply chain is not really something that an individual person in a company can control. But you end up being the face of the company. You're the one that took the order and now it's not delivered. You're the one that's going to get the ire. Or in the case of this was an integration project that didn't go perfectly. Oh, surprise, surprise. We had a bad controller just happen to show up, and then the lead engineer on the project, her kid got sick, and it's just like Murphy's Law, one of those things. You never know what kind of random stuff will go wrong. And then the timeline got too extended. But then on the flip side, the customer didn't properly set, like, the SOW was not the way it should have been in the beginning. They had a contract PLC programmer that they acted like they did it in-house. They did not specify that there would be a third party coming in to do the controls later on. And so when we asked questions about how we were going to interface with the PLC, they said yes, or fine, or this works. And then when the third party, integrator, the PLC programmer came in later, he's like, no, this is not how it works. This is not how I do it. And it's like, you just have to go through one of those crap projects to learn the red flags that you got to look for up front, right? So that chronic project that you mentioned, because I've been around for a while, to me, as soon as you said, with the hardware they had already specified, to me, I was like, whoa, red flag. Okay, so you're expecting this to work with something that was selected already and may or may not, by the time you get that far down the road, have been the right thing to specify.
Exactly.
And I've unfortunately been on the other end of that as well, being tasked with making something work that wasn't specified correctly in the first place. But then the customer's like, well, we already bought it. We don't have budget to buy more, so just make it work. And you kind of end up getting stuck between a rock and a hard place, trying to make it. But you're like, not all things are in my control.
Yeah, there's that delicate balance between, like what the customer expects of you and what you can realistically accomplish with that hardware. A smart camera can only do so much. Like, I know they're kind of a miracle solution for a lot of very simple applications, but when you're talking
catalog applications,
but when you're talking about like multiple vehicle styles, multiple positions and everything, and it gets very complicated very fast, and it usually exceeds the hardware's limitations in terms of memory or speed, all that kind of stuff. So it gets really tricky when they get stuck on it has to be this.
Yeah. That's a tricky part when you have very slick salespeople that maybe don't have all the field experience to know the edge cases, that the gotchas, right? And based on the specs, it should work, right? And machine vision is one of those things that is so much dependent on the installation in practice.
Oh, goodness. Yeah.
Talk about lighting a little bit, like love-hate relationship with lighting. Like, I almost feel like I have a love-hate relationship with the sun now, like have dealt with facilities that operate 24 hours a day with skylights everywhere.
There was this one system that the first company I worked for had put in that the electricians were saying that, like, it's really weird because, like, for a couple days, a month, for 1 month a year, this system just keeps consistently, doing all sorts of failures. It won't go pick the part. We don't know what's going on. And so we go in there and we look and we realize there's a window right up above, opposite of where that camera is. And we're, it's like the Stonehenge of vision, because like for a very small window of the year, the sun is positioned just perfectly that it's going to shine through that window directly into the lens of the camera and completely obscure everything that it's looking at.
Yeah.
There's some really stupid problems with lighting, that's for sure.
And then one thing I ran into once was budget constraints, so they decided not to put a monitor on the system at all. So then it makes it very hard to see what's going on at any given time, right?
Right. My favorite is when they give you a whole bunch of, there's a bunch of false failures coming through, and they're like, what's going on? So then you go back and you review all the images, and half of them are of an operator's head in the way, blocking the part. And it's like, well, that's, I can't look through this guy's head, so that's probably the issue.
Do we not have X-ray imaging systems at this point? I'm sure that's a class of product for different reasons, like metal detection and stuff like that. Do you think that you'll stick around with vision for a while in your career, or do you see now the more plants you go into, the more applications you work on? Is there shiny new objects in the automation space, like up or down the line, that have drawn your interest, or are you still pretty invested in and interested in machine vision?
So I'd still say that vision is my, my first love. It's my passion. It's what I know at this point. So I foresee staying in vision for the foreseeable future. But I've always had, my second love is robotics. If
Um,
anything, robotics is kind of what started all my engineering career right from the start. Um, and so I've worked a little bit with robot programming, here and there, especially when I was doing the robot guidance stuff. I'd have to, teach the paths and everything. So I've done
mhm.
some work with robotics, but I don't know that I would want to do it full time necessarily. It's one of those things where I'm one of those people who likes variety, so I do like to bounce around from thing to thing, here and there. So robots are really cool, and I like to do them for short stints of time, but maybe not as a whole career worth moving forward.
Well, they go really hand in hand. So you'll end up probably, you can really do a lot more robot applications focusing on the vision and vice versa. And then vision is there's so much variety within that discipline to begin with that because like every application is different anyway. I found that for me being I found out last year that I have ADHD, which makes a lot of things in my life make a lot of sense. But one of them is my sort of like interest in a lot of things that people don't always understand. Like, why would you do that? It's not what you do. And I'm like, but I can learn it. And my interest for so long because there is so much variety to it, both in the applications and then also, the technology has just been steadily improving. There's been so many advancements. And so when I was doing it, just the 3 years I was doing it, I think we came out with like 3 new systems. And so every year there would be a new thing to learn from, a product perspective, a new type of, camera or a new type of algorithm or new software or new lighting, patterns and lighting controllers that made it easier. It seems like a never ending world. If you could stay interested, I guess, sticking with that probably for the rest of your career.
Absolutely, especially with the new technologies coming out. Well, I guess they're not super new at this point, but they're still emerging technologies. Specifically with like 3D vision and point clouds. That's something that I'm seeing a lot of push for lately.
Okay.
It's a really fascinating like new division of machine vision, and it's a bit tricky because I don't feel like any of the vision vendors really do it well just yet in terms of, there's a lot of good sensor companies where you can get a great acquisition of the part in 3D space,
Yeah.
but a lot of the vision software providers just don't have a fantastic solution right now for, translating tools both in 2D and 3D space on a 3D capture. And that's something that I'm excited to see advancements in the future because I do feel that there's a very real application for 3D vision, specifically in like bin picking or
Yeah.
like even metrology, checking for locations of things, getting that finite detail in all 3 axes. So that's something that I'm interested to see more advancement in. And the other big technology that's been emerging for a while has been AI and deep learning.
Yeah.
That one, I know there's been a big push in all the vision vendors. AI both impresses and frustrates me at the same time.
It gives
It's
you the illusion that it's really good, and then until it's not, and then you can't fine tune it like you can a traditional system, right? So you have
that
less control over when it doesn't work, how to make it work.
that's exactly where my frustration lies with it because like you can have a fantastic neural net trained and then it starts false failing on one particular type of failure. So then you go in and you try to retrain it, and then when you retrain it, it's like hitting a randomize button. And so when you had a fantastic training before, all of a sudden it just blows that out of the water and starts from scratch, and now it might not be as good as it was originally. And there's not a whole lot of way to fine tune that yet. I'm sure they're finding ways to work that into the algorithms moving forward, but that's definitely where my frustration bubbles from
Yeah.
right now in AI.
Okay. Well, glad to hear somebody's kind of on the ground perspective because obviously the vendors will, you know, show you all the best case scenarios and stuff. And then I've kind of been so interestingly, I guess this may not be interesting to other people, but I'll talk about myself here. I left the industry. I've had a bit of a roundabout kind of career, coming back to industrial automation after going into some design engineering software, simulation software, then AI, supply chain stuff, mostly data analytics. But at the time I worked for an AI startup, we were exploring various different applications of neural nets. for commercial applications, to not just like to take basically if like a new Google paper came out about a neural net that, you know, was new or some new capability. We had a department that would kind of vet that for real world use cases. And we implemented a lot of early sort of proof of concept applications for neural nets for Fortune 500 companies, manufacturers, mostly in consumer goods. And those were interesting because they were kind of like everybody knew that it may or may not work, which is why we call it a proof of concept, right? We put some bounding box around it, a little bit of budget, and say, hey, let's see if this is feasible. And that was something different from like my machine vision days, which was always kind of test it first, and then if somebody's going to pay for it, they want it to be. And this is different because I didn't work for a systems integrator or somebody that like takes on the paid work of doing the integration. It was really like I either prove the system works or I don't, and that like I either sell it or don't. So working through a potential solution with a customer that sometimes ends up you have to say, actually, this doesn't work. And in those early days of AI, it was often like, okay, let's see if AI can do this better than traditional methods. And at the end of the day, you end up with, no, actually, we should just use a better stack of, you know, traditional machine learning algorithms and do more deterministic, you know, if this and that statements, and architect a system that doesn't involve a neural net, but it gets you, you know, a huge percentage of where you wanted to go without implementing something so novel that can have such completely weird results that like are hard to explain, right? Because a lot of those things really are kind of a black box in terms of how they work, which for engineers I think is uncomfortable because you want to be able to know the steps and the physics and like the specific levers that you can tweak along the way to come up with a good solution. But I
absolutely
backing up at the time, computer vision was just becoming a term, right? It's when AlexNet was able to like finally determine like what was a dog or different breeds of dogs or something, and all these really, really smart scientists from all these top universities and stuff were working on computer vision problems, which is different from machine vision because it relies totally just on working on the images. The acquiring of the images is just kind of out of the picture, right? It had nothing to do with it. It's like, let's work on a bunch of, you know, images we can find on Google or whatever. And so I always had like this really glaring, I don't want to say disrespect, but just skepticism about the usefulness of any of that stuff, because I'm like, yeah, and then good luck doing that on a real live capture like image. How are you going to make sure that you can get that image in the right format or with, you know, enough contrast or whatever?
Right.
Because yeah, after having done a lot of those demos where you've got a printed card with an example of a whatever, like a nut on it, like it's different from taking a picture of a real nut that's in 3D that has all kinds of shades, and you know, it depends on the time of day. And I, at the time, having been in machine vision and then pneumatics and automation and motion, and then I went into physics simulation, and then I went into AI. People are like, oh, these things are totally unrelated. Why do you keep doing something completely new? And then I kind of had this idea that one day they'll all come together somehow. You know? But now I no longer do machine vision, and now that the AI is involved, I've always been like kind of curious, like how close are they for it to be a real game changer? Because I, you know, I've also heard anecdotally for some of the people that have worked with some of these startups, a lot of the challenges just end up being the real world integration of these things, right? You can do really fantastic things in the lab with the tech on images that you have from something, but then going out and recreating that at another customer site for a different line, for a different application, there's just devils in the details that, you know, it's like talking to ChatGPT. It sounds really smart until it doesn't. And then once it forgets your instructions and it starts to just, you're like, no, I told you to do this. And it's like, yeah, you're just like, I don't even know how to reason with you at this point, because this is not like a logical conversation that we're having. But it is a fun time to be, I think, in this space. A lot of traditional tech still being used, a lot of emerging tech coming online, and then somebody's got to figure out what can we actually use, right? And it's a probably fun and frustrating position to be in at the same time.
Absolutely. Yeah. Especially with all the with all the competition, if everybody has a comparable sensor nowadays, how do you pick which one is truly the best for the application? Do you just go based on who's cheapest for the customer, or who has the shiniest tools? It's a fine balance to figure out which of those is actually going to be the magic solution for your problem. And sometimes it isn't clean and clear. Like sometimes there are actually multiple possible solutions for one problem. And that's actually fantastic, because then usually you can arrive at a solution pretty quickly, because there's multiple ways of getting there. But there's a lot behind determining what's truly the correct solution for this, and I think that's one of the driving reasons why integrators are so crucial to a successful implementation, because like a lot of these vendors are trying to make their products accessible enough that the customer can do it themselves, and then they get this kind of like false confidence of like, oh yeah, well that looks easy, I just plug it in and you give it 5 images and you tell it that's good, that's bad, and then it'll magically solve all my problems. But then they do that, and then they end up calling us like, hey, so they sold us this vision system and it's not working how they told us it would. Come fix it. And then we come and realize that they picked the wrong thing right from the start. It's a little heartbreaking for the customer, but it's ultimately what an integrator is supposed to do. We're supposed to help you figure out what's right for the solution, Yeah.
Yeah. And I think there's a little bit of like, some companies that want to go direct, they have these messages like, oh, you don't need an integrator anymore, right? You can do it all yourself. Or like, we can equip you to do it in-house. And I think there's some narrative in some circles that integrators don't add a lot of value. And I think you've just never really worked with one if you don't realize what value they bring to the table.
Right.
Granted, there maybe are some companies that, they've had enough failed projects, or they didn't somehow... And I'm not, just like every type of business, there's a spectrum of good to bad, to everywhere in between. But I think on the whole, the more I've learned, just like the more I've learned about like the distribution channel, even though in some cases, like a person my age, I'm like, why do you need a distributor? Can't you just go to Amazon or like MasterCard and just buy something, right? And then I realized actually the conversation we were having before we started recording, I don't do a podcast as my full-time job. I'm not an audio engineer. I'm not a podcaster. I'm not a podcast producer. I make a podcast in my spare time. So I don't have the time to become the expert at all podcast streaming, recording, software, and all of that stuff. The mics, the mixers, the audio. It's not my area of expertise, and I don't have enough incentive to spend my time becoming the expert at that thing. And that's really, I think, our landscape of technology is so vast that just the plant engineer does not have the time to become the expert in a specific technology. They're the expert in their process, right? They're the expert in their solution. I mean, in the product that they're making, and the technology that they have to work with, and the technologies that maybe their team is proficient in, right? That's their expertise. Right. And then you have a vendor coming in to say, hey, my widget solves your problem. I'm the expert, and shout out to Enders Hauser. So I happen to be drinking my coffee out of this mug. They are the location host for OT Skatacon this year, so they deserve an appropriate shout out. But let's say like an instrument manufacturer, right? They're going to be like, hey, my instrument is the best, and they're the expert in that particular type of instrument solving the problem. And then sometimes you have a gap in the middle. It's like the expertise in knowing where to apply that particular solution to that plant's situation, right? And you end up almost as like a translator, the glue, the thing that actually makes the thing work eventually. And yeah, I think systems integration is something that's just not very well known and not very well understood to those that haven't ever been involved. And the other thing is, it's like you almost can't ever really judge a systems integrator either on their solutions on the face of it, because there's often so many constraints you have to work with that are not in your control. Like you said, walking into a project that's already been screwed up, walking into hardware that was misspecified that you're tasked with making it work, and somebody that looks at your work and go, why on earth would you choose that? And you're like, I didn't. Like, that wasn't my job. So I just also want to say, like, thank you for the job that you do. I know it's hard and it's so necessary, and it takes a certain type of person to be willing to, like, sit under that pressure all day. it's a different type of pressure from like a plant engineer, but I think yeah, you're absolutely right. Our profession is not for everyone. Just like being an entrepreneur is not for everyone. Some people just need to come in and collect a paycheck and go home. And like speaking about that like it's a bad thing, I don't I don't think that that's necessary. Like there are different types of people with different skill sets, different personalities, and all kinds of different fields and jobs. And they're all important. And we need the type of people that are happy to clock in and clock out. And then we need the type of people that are willing to do this crap that we do.
Absolutely. And I think it's important to kind of promote that, even though not every single engineer has to be a people person in addition to a technical person, I think it's important to foster those who do have more aptitude or more appeal for, being the customer facing individual. Um, I'm a little bit more on that people-y side myself. I was, in a sorority in college, so I was not one of the typical engineers. I wasn't sitting there behind the computer 24/7. I was out having fun and doing service events and everything.
Yeah,
So
that's really what I thought engineering was, which is why I chose part of the reason why I chose not to get an engineering degree. I was like, I don't want to sit behind a desk and never talk to people.
Right, exactly. Yeah, and I feel like it's helped me having that balance. I might not be as hard technical as some of my colleagues on my team are, because some of them can do absolutely wonderful feats of engineering. Like they come up with these fantastic systems. I'm like, wow, I could never have figured that out myself. But there's a place, and there's an important place for people who are capable of doing both the technical and being that more, soft skills, people facing individual. And I don't think that we all have to get trapped into, I wouldn't say trapped, but, like pushed into sales. It's definitely appealing to people like that to go into sales and everything, but that's not your only option. And I feel like it's helped me out because I just recently transitioned actually from being an engineer into a project manager. And
I was about to say, project managers are so needed and they need the people skills, but they also need to know what they're managing. So like the actual work that engineers are doing.
Yeah. And so that's been a whole transition in and of itself. And I'm still figuring out all the ropes and everything, like what's a Gantt chart and, what are all these 50 bajillion documents that I owe the customer that I didn't know existed before. But I feel like those soft skills really come into play when you get into like project management or sales or any of those things, specifically because you need to be able to translate what the hard technical people are saying to those who maybe are not as technical, like the decision makers at the customer.
Yep.
And
that's a huge, it's very important skill set.
Yeah, and it's something that I feel like we don't really foster well enough in our industry because there's so much focus on being the technical expert of everything hard technical. You go program the PLC and become an expert and do only that. It's not really fostered of, oh yeah, you can program the PLC, but also go explain this to, upper management, why they need this solution. So I feel like we can do a better job as an industry, kind of giving people who are in that kind of happy middle ground more space to really thrive.
You're absolutely right. And that's one of the reasons why we did the show is we wanted to show more women and hopefully just, kind of have like how me and Allie and Courtney like met on LinkedIn. We saw each other's content, we connected, and I didn't realize like that I was missing something. Like I enjoy having friends that have this common interest in the work that we do, and I'd never really had that. And I was thinking like there's so many of us kind of scattered around, like maybe one in a group or one in a company or maybe two or three, right? But like we don't always, especially even if we're women, doesn't mean that we want to be friends with or talk to the other women in our company just because we have a gender in common, right? It's
exactly.
Like, the reason you're attracted to talking to or spending time with or listening to other people, it's typically like a few things that kind of make them your cup of tea, right? And we were all not interested in being like shoved at the other woman in the room. But then when we found each other and had this conversation in common and we got excited about the same things, we realized that it actually is really cool to have gender in common with someone that then we can talk about the technical stuff and, maybe some experiences that we just never got a chance to talk to anybody about. So part of why we did the show was to do that. We also wanted to see more content by women in the industry. And part of, I don't know, my philosophy is like, if you bitch about something long enough, you better do something about it or just shut up. Like, and
Right.
so even though I don't feel like I'm any kind of content creator, we were just like, well, if we're going to complain about there not being content by women, let's do something about it. But then third was like, I realized that I had been in a lot of plants, but I was always on the machine vision system. So it was either plants that were already automating, plants that were interested in automating something. And so I was there to look at automation. When somebody mentioned to me like a millwright, I was like, who's that and what do they do? I realized there's so many jobs that are related to what I did that I have no idea what they are. And some of them are very cool. And then I've met some people that, you know, they really didn't have a good experience in their job in the industry, and then they left the industry for something totally different. And it made me think, like, if more people knew all of the types of like adjacent jobs that maybe some of your skills can be transferable, but they may be a better fit for you personality wise, or, you know, life stage even, right? When you're young and single and you don't have kids versus when you have a family versus when you're closer to retirement, there's different types of jobs with different types of, you know, requirements, and whether it's a lot of travel, right? Do that early on in your career if you can. Get that hands-on experience under your belt so that maybe later you can sit more in the office, but you still have that experience to draw on, right? Or once you become a project manager, right? You know the real life situations that your team is getting into, and you can, you know, explain that to the customer. So that's exactly why we do this show. And I love that. I feel like this is one of my favorite episodes so far this season, probably because I connect with your story so much. But B, it really kind of like brings home the reason why we do this show, is to tell people the good and the bad and the ugly about the stuff that we do, because for some people it's totally their cup of tea, and like you can do it no matter what your background is if you're interested enough and if you've got the aptitude and if you got the resilience, I think, to like get fires and a little bit of crying, like if you have been in this industry in the controls or automation world for like, let's say over 10 years and you have not yet cried on the job, I would like to hear from you. Maybe your tear ducts don't work, or you've just never things, but I feel like at this point it should be normalized. So I guess we're up on the hour here. So is there anything that I did not ask or I didn't touch on, because I tend to be long-winded and treat this as a conversation rather than an interview? But yeah, is there anything we missed that you want to make sure that we talk about or get out to our audience?
Not that I can really think of off the top of my head, you know, just my main focus, you know, as not only an engineer, but also as like a, you know, LinkedIn presence that I'm trying to build up a little bit of a reputation on there, is just that, you know, it's possible for anybody to do what we do. You know, it'll take a lot of work probably, depending on where you start out. Because, you know, I was the weirdo who was really, really, really bad at math, and I decided to go into engineering because it was the only thing I wanted to do. Even though I was really bad at it. So like even if it's not your forte right from the start, you can learn these skills. It just takes passion to fuel you to get there. And that's exactly what I'm trying to do, is trying to get more eyes and more optics on our industry and helping more people realize that, you know, there's something really cool here, and that if I'm actually interested in it, that I can go do that too. So
and if you need some support, some encouragement, you know, you have questions, there are people out there that are willing to help you, give you some tips. Granted, don't go into somebody's DMs and be like, teach me how to do this. Like, nobody's got the time for that. And nobody can, you know, in one LinkedIn message teach you how to do something. But if you're a curious enough person that is willing to work hard and you show some of your passion, people are willing to help you. Like, there are so many good people in this industry that know the lack of talent, that know that we need this pipeline, that they will give you tips, they will informally mentor you, whatever that is. Just, you know, be a smart person when you ask for help, right? Give or show that you've put in some effort, and then you want a little bit of help along the way. Reach out to any of us. I think most of our guests are, you know, they're also here to kind of get the word out, and they're also willing to help. So if you're not following Kerry Pierce on LinkedIn already, you should. Her profile will be linked in the guest profile on automationladies.io. And I have, I guess one more question before our final question. When you do restart your comic strip, if you do, are you still going to call it the Engine Noob? Because I feel like you're not a noob anymore.
So I feel like there's gonna be a couple different like seasons of this comic, how I foresee it going. And it's gonna stay the ingenue, because that's the catchy title that I started out with, and I feel like
Yeah,
that's a good hook line.
it is.
But so it's gonna kind of progress, throughout her career. She's gonna be in this kind of newbie stage for about one season, maybe 1.5 seasons. There's a few more episodes that I want to do into season one before I really move on to the next. And then just kind of showing her progression, as she becomes an engineer who can actually start teaching someone else, which is a whole other thing in
Yeah.
and of itself when you get to that point. And then maybe she'll even make a pivot like I did into project management further on. So it's going to be a fun adventure moving forward, and I look forward to continuing it.
And then you become a noob all over again. Like some of us can't stop like starting at the bottom of a steep learning curve constantly. Well, Kerry,
Absolutely.
thank you so much for spending time with us. Our last question is also just your kind of way to sign off. Where do you want people to go to follow you? Is there anything that they should be aware of that you have coming up? Give us your best pitch for any of the things that you want our listeners to know about you, or what kind of actions to take if they want to connect with you or follow you or do business with you in your company.
Yeah, so I really only have a real presence on LinkedIn at the moment. I'm not really looking to expand too much to other platforms, but so LinkedIn is probably the best way to get a hold of me. As for following my company and everything, that's Indicon. They have a company page on LinkedIn as well. I'd be more than happy to share that with anybody who wants to inquire about something, or if they have, an application they'd like us to look at. I'll be more than happy to get in contact with you. But yeah, I look forward to hearing from more people, and hopefully sharing war stories of being on site and everything goes wrong. I love hearing those uh-oh moments from other people. So if someone wants to share those with me, I'd love to hear them and just kind of commiserate over those shared experiences. But yeah, I'm kind of a weirdo who likes to share her funny stories and just kind of bring more eyes to our field. So that's kind of what I'm all about.
Love it. Yes, weirdos unite. So thank you so much for your time. Thank you everybody that was listening. I'm going to give a shout out to our current sponsor. There should be an ad that got placed somewhere in the earlier part of the episode, if I got this right. And here's my newbie podcasting producing showing. But SPS Atlanta is our sponsor up until September. And if you're not familiar with SPS, it's the Smart Production Solutions show that is very popular, one of the biggest automation shows in Europe, in Germany. I believe they have 2 different shows in Europe, and they're now bringing it to the US for the first time. It is in Atlanta, which I think, is very appropriate for the sort of growing southern manufacturing base there, lots of automotive. I hope to see you there. Automation Ladies is actually going to be podcasting live from the show with our own setup this time. This is our first time going to a show and having our own podcast studio, I guess. We're figuring that out. We went to the Assembly Show South in Nashville once, and we had a booth, but we still didn't know what we were doing at all. We didn't do any sort of specific podcasting there. I think I went live with my phone a couple times. So if you're a part of our audience, I think by now you've forgiven our terrible newbie production value, because this is not our full-time job. And again, I hope you appreciate that, because we are trying to fit this in with everything else that we do. And Allie and Courtney, I know, are bummed that they weren't here for this episode. I know Courtney has got so many stories to share and relate with you, Kerry, as well, as she's been a machine vision integrator for a good portion of her career, as well as a robotics integrator. I believe what pulled her away was actually a chronic project. And then Allie also has a lot of experience, kind of moving from the engineering into the project management. And there's a whole discussion to be had there, which maybe we'll do a panel discussion sometime about something like that. But I hope we have you back, Kerry, as a kind of reoccurring guest on Automation Ladies. We really appreciate your content on LinkedIn. And thank you, everybody that was listening. Have a great rest of your day. Bye.